We're slowly drawing closer to the end of 2021. And that means, of course, Christmas, the New Year. It means celebrations, lunches, dinners, family gatherings, outings, and what have you. Although, mind you, this year things might not be normal yet again because of the dreadful COVID-19 pandemic and this latest variant, the Omicron variant, that has actually thrown a spanner in the works yet again. But just before we get to the end of the year, I'm going to throw in another YouTube episode to share with you. And this one is number 27, and it focuses on my intuitive reactions to Nagorno-Karabakh and Armenian matters. And I'm going to basically highlight only 2 points, more food for thought than anything else. You've got the holiday period coming. If you're at all interested, you could think about these couple of points that I make today, and you can research them, write about them, or pretty much ignore them and just enjoy the mulled wine and the roasted chestnuts or marshmallows. The first one has to do with something called remedial secession or earned sovereignty. Now, I am raising this issue because I watched, must have been about a couple of weeks ago, or perhaps a bit more, an interview that Eric Hakopian of CivilNet TV did with Nerses Kopalian, who is professor of political science at the University of Nevada in Las Vegas. And in this interview, Professor Nerses Kopalian focused on the issue of remedial sovereignty, and there are words that were in that conversation: secession, sovereignty, phased sovereignty, and of course the tools that would make this possible. And all this was made in the context, of course, of the current realities, the current painful and uncertain realities facing Armenians and facing pretty much the Southern Caucasus due to the outcome of the recent war between Azerbaijan and Armenians over the enclave of Nagorno-Karabakh. Now, what were these principles that Professor Kopalian was referring to and trying to tease out with his viewers? Well, to answer that question, I need to go back to a paper that St. Antony's College in Oxford published, an occasional paper by 2 authors that examined the main justifications for recognizing Kosovo's independence. The themes and the terms and the principles that they examined consisted of: is it remedial secession or earned sovereignty? There were also other terms in that paper, such as remedial sovereignty or earned statehood. And as the paper developed and their arguments developed, it was quite clear to me that they were not leaning on the side of remedial secession, but were looking at other alternatives that might be more successful. And remedial sovereignty was described as a process by which an oppressed people realize statehood by invoking remedial secession and undergoing a transitional period of mediated international administration characterized by elements of sovereignty which are externally designed and internally earned. Now, this might sound a bit of a heavy-duty sentence that we lawyers might use to explain a principle in international law, but what applied to Kosovo could also in some ways apply to other situations, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, perhaps even China and Spain. Professor Kopalian also mentioned the Yazidis. So basically, the idea is that you have got a community of people in a space of land, Armenians in Karabakh, who are facing ethnic cleansing or who are facing persecution or who are facing difficulties by the host state. So what are the tools that they could use in order to basically run their own affairs? And within that, of course, those principles that were bandied about in the occasional paper, but that Professor Nerses Kopalian also referred to, was the question, okay, so there are principles. Let us assume that one of those principles would apply to Nagorno-Karabakh, as it did rather imperfectly to Kosovars as well. Who or what is the mechanism to implement it? And here, of course, the question comes to the OSCE Minsk group and whether this group would be able to apply the stages that would lead to that earned sovereignty or statehood or secession or phased sovereignty, if you wish, and that being the fact that the Aliyev administration in Azerbaijan these days does not recognize really the validity of the OSCE Minsk group. Insofar as they're concerned, a war has happened, the balance has shifted, the reality is different, and therefore the OSCE has nothing to mediate about. So it is more a question of getting on with the job, of taking the enclave and finishing off this rebellion, as the Azerbaijani regime might perhaps describe the Armenian presence in the enclave. So what I'm going to do, given the fact that I cannot either discuss the occasional paper from St. Anthony's College at Oxford University, nor do I want to regurgitate what Professor Nerses Kopalian said, I'm going to put that link in the description box. It's not a long interview. You can listen to it and you can decide whether it makes sense for you or not. And you don't really need to be a lawyer to understand it. International law, as I have learned over the years, is something that is quite reader-friendly to people who haven't done law as well. And whilst we're on the theme of Nagorno-Karabakh and on the theme of what kind of remedies could apply to find a solution to what appears to be an intractable problem, i.e. Nagorno-Karabakh today, which is so complicated, Azeris and Armenians living cheek by jowl, Russians trying to desperately at times keep the peace, borders being violated. You can read the paper. You can also read the St. Anthony's paper and decide whether you think it makes sense and take it forward. But since we're, as I said, on the theme of Nagorno-Karabakh, and for good measure, I suppose, I'm going to also add two other links for you on the same subject, both of them actually having to do with the enclave and the war and the consequences, the nefarious consequences of the war. One is an interview, again, by Eric Hakopian of CivilNet TV with the Boston-based Nubar Afeyan, who will talk about the Moderna vaccine. He will discuss both, therefore, the Omicron variant and what happens there. Plus, I think he will also give some very germane and helpful reflections on the Armenia diaspora relations, something that I have touched upon briefly over many episodes, and that he also highlights and puts en relief the problems between Armenia as the republic and the diaspora. And I think it would be worth your while investing a few minutes to listen to that during your holidays or whenever. And the other one is something quite interesting. I don't know if it exists as a principle, I've never heard of it, but Eric Hakopian talked about President Aliyev's compellence diplomacy, as viewed at Sochi when the three, Pashinyan, Aliyev, and Putin met. And I suppose, in a nutshell, what compellence diplomacy would mean is that I am the one with the power, with the force. Might is right. We don't have to go to Aliyev, we can go to Bismarck. Might is right, therefore I'm going to compel you to do what I want you to do, or else you will suffer the consequences. So that's the second link I will put as well, in addition to the one from St. Anthony's College and Professor Nerses Kopalyan. Now, the second part of this brief pre-Christmas, pre-New Year episode of Intuitive Reactions, number 27, I want to basically focus it on another interview done, but this time not, guess what, by Eric Hakopian, but by Emilio Criccio, who is his colleague at CivilNet TV in Yerevan. And this one was with a member of parliament in the UK, in London, with Tim Loughton. Now, Tim is the acting director of the Home Affairs Select Committee in the British Parliament, and he is also, I think, chair of the Armenian British Parliamentary Group. Now, the conversation that Emilio had with Tim Loughton had nothing to do, well, it's something to do, but remotely, with Karabakh, because the focus was on the Armenian genocide and the recognition by the United Kingdom, by London, by the British Parliament of this genocide, in view of the fact that key Western countries, let's not only talk about the global South and smaller countries, but key Western countries, amongst them I would only have to mention three: Germany, France, and the United States. And I can also add, for good measure here, because it has a faith-related value, the Holy See or the Vatican have recognized this genocide. So the question was, what about the UK? Why isn't the UK recognizing it? And Tim Loughton actually talked about, with Emilio, about a process that is going through Parliament, where he submitted a request to discuss the Armenian genocide in view of it being debated in 2022. I think it's on a list which is supposed to come up in March of next year, and see whether the Parliament would vote for recognition. Now, many of you, I think, know by now that I ran the campaign for recognition of the Armenian genocide in England and Wales and in Scotland for a number of years, about 10, 15 years ago. And during my term, we managed to get recognition in Scotland, and we managed to consolidate recognition in Wales. But despite all my lobbying efforts, I did not manage to do that in London at the House of Commons, at the British Parliament, whether it's the House of Commons or the House of Lords, for a very simple reason. The government at the time, and the government definitely today, is not inclined to recognize the genocide, and in so doing upset their ally Turkey. Now, I can say a lot about that. You can go to the CRAG, or Campaign for Recognition of Armenian Genocide, write-ups that I've done, which explain fully the fallacy of this argument that we will upset Turkey and that will be bad for us. Well, I can give you case after case, example after example, how this did not happen. But the question remains that there is a reluctance by the British government and by the powers to be to recognize the Armenian genocide, despite all the remembrance services, despite all the letters sent to 10 Downing Street, despite all the attempts to make something out of this matter in the UK. It is not in the public consciousness. The Armenian community here is too small and ineffective to be able to have any political weight that would make the government consider it more seriously. And to be honest with you, there hasn't been the consistency and the investment, human, financial, and resources of the Armenian community for this purpose in this country. I remember, for instance, during my term running CRAG with my board, what I used to do is something that was not specifically mentioned in the interview with Emilio Criccio. I used to encourage some members of parliament, very few, who were interested in the Armenian genocide and the issue of recognition, to introduce early day motions in the Westminster system. And what is an early day motion, an EDM? An EDM is a motion that is expressed in a single sentence, tabled by members of parliament, that formally call for debate on an early date. In practice, though, and this will apply as well to Tim Loughton's efforts now, in practice, they are rarely debated in the House, and their main purpose is to draw attention to particular subjects of interest or relevance. EDMs are not only about genocides, EDMs could be about anything that impacts or affects British citizens and British constituents. If their member of parliament manages to introduce an EDM, then that goes there. There is a little bit of hype. People suddenly get aware that there is this situation. Depends how many people support it, how many people sign up for it, and it either dies down miserably or dies down after some noise. And this brings me to the fact that EDMs and Tim Loughton's attempt in Parliament is not really to achieve recognition. Sadly, I have to admit this, but in order to keep the matter alive, because the Armenian genocide is over 100 years old now, to keep the matter alive, not to let the dust of history completely hide or mask away this reality that impacts Armenians from one end of the world to the other, and also a rather light attempt to embarrass the government by saying, how can you not recognize a genocide that Sir Winston Churchill wrote about, that is in the Blue Book in the UK, and that has so much literature about it? How can you do that and still claim you are a democracy who upholds principles of justice and equity? That basically is what it is. And that, just like the various remedial solutions to Nagorno-Karabakh, brings me to two words. The whole issue is not legal, is not anthropological, it is political. If there is a political will, it could be done. If there is no political will, then I cannot see either a recognition of the genocide, whether it's Tim Loughton, whether it's whoever else. I can name you some members of parliament who worked hard to make some movement on that in the past when I was with Crag and they failed. The system is impregnable to such attempts, and it takes a lateral thinking in order to be able to create a chink in the armor of government. It's all political, whether on that one or on the more global and more pressing and more immediate situation of Nagorno-Karabakh and the various solutions that international law provides to find a way out of the painful reality there today. I leave all this with you. I will put the links in the description box. And after talking about what I would consider somewhat gloomy topics, I still would say Merry and blessed Christmas to you. Happy New Year. Shnorhavor Surp Zununt Yev Amanori. There you go. I hope we'll meet again in early 2022, and all the best to you.